All right. All right. Well, first and foremost, let me welcome everybody to the second discussion in our series examining the evolution of the situation in Venezuela and its far-reaching implications. I'm Brian Fonseca, director of the Jack D. Gordon Institute for Public Policy at Florida International University. The issue that we're here to talk about today resonates deeply, of course, with our community here in South Florida, our students, and we're confident it will continue to pose critical challenges for the U.S., especially as we prepare for a transition in administrations. Today's discussion, titled "The New Trump Administration's Policy Towards Venezuela: Return to Maximum Pressure or Explore New Options," will discuss or examine what might come next. Of course, as many of you remember, during the first Trump administration, the maximum pressure campaign in an effort to dislodge Maduro failed. And so the questions will remain as to what an incoming Trump administration might do with respect to U.S. policy towards Venezuela. The Venezuelan crisis is not just a story about political and economic collapse, it's also a profound human story that has rippled across borders. Miami, as a hub for Venezuelan diaspora, feels these impacts more than most. In fact, if you're from Miami, you're acutely familiar with Little Caracas, also known as Doral, or West Venezuela in the southern part of Fort Lauderdale. And so our community has incredibly deep ties, invested interest in understanding American foreign policy to Venezuela, and of course, deeply invested in the prospects of change. Our community has been a place of refuge and resilience and advocacy, with our community bearing witness to both the challenges and contributions of Venezuelans who have made Miami their home. For our students, Venezuela offers a real-world case study that connects classroom theory to global events. It challenges them to grapple with complex issues of governance, human rights, migration, economic recovery, and of course, geopolitics. It underscores the critical role of leadership in addressing crisis, whether through policy, diplomacy, or grassroots action. For the United States, Venezuela represents both a challenge and an opportunity. The crisis tests our foreign policy priorities in the Western Hemisphere. And of course, with the prospects of the former FIU professor and Senator Marco Rubio, it's going to raise important questions about sanctions, diplomacy, humanitarian aid, and how the next administration is going to deal with these and reconcile some of these issues. With the change in administration, we face important moments to reassess our approach and ensure it aligns with our values, our strategic interests, and regional partnerships. Not just regional partnerships, actually global partnerships. This discussion specifically, as part two in our three-part series, will explore the themes around sort of change in administration. Our distinguished panel, led by someone who needs no introduction, my former professor, my current mentor, and of course my close friend, Dr. Eduardo Gamarra, will sort of navigate a very thoughtful panel of distinguished guests, several of which I find, I consider very personal friends, incredible thought leaders on the subject. And so I'm excited to have them here to join us today. And so with that, Dr. Gamarra, I'm going to turn the floor over to you.
Thank you so much, Brian, and thank you for that that introduction that sets the stage for this afternoon's very, very important discussion. I'm going to introduce the speakers, and then once I do that, we will launch right into the seminar. The idea is to have a very open discussion. So I'll ask a broad question, and we'll go around the table, so to speak, and then we'll start again. The idea, of course, is to have as broad a discussion as possible. So your answers should be no longer than three minutes each, maybe 5 if you really feel compelled to go a little bit longer, so that we can have more rounds of this. So let me begin by introducing Juan Gonzalez, who again many of you are very, very familiar with Juan's role as the former senior director for the Western Hemisphere at the National Security Council. He used to also serve before as a special assistant to President Joe Biden. and of course he's an expert on U.S. Latin American relations, and there's probably a few people more knowledgeable of current U.S. policy toward Venezuela. So thank you, Juan, for joining us. Our second speaker is John Magdaleno, who almost feels now like he's part of our program here, because he's been at just about every Venezuela event we've had in the last few months. So he's a professor at the Institute of Higher Studies in Administration and the Advanced Studies Program in Political Analysis at Andrés Bello, the Catholic University in Caracas. So John, thank you again for joining us. And finally, we will have Hussein Khalut, who's going to log on in a couple of minutes. He's a
I'm already here.
Oh, you're here. Great.
Yep.
Welcome, Hussein.
Thanks.
Political scientist from the University of Brasilia. He's PhD from Lancaster University in the UK, and he's currently an advisory board member at SEBRI, the Brazilian Center for International Relations. He's also the editor-in-chief of the SEBRI Journal. So that's our panel, and so let me get started, and perhaps the the way to begin this is sort of asking each of you to sort of give me a reaction, right? In a sense, to the results of the of the November 5th election, and what does it mean broadly in terms of U.S. policy toward Venezuela in particular, but if you want, maybe kind of look at it more broadly in the region as well. So an initial reaction to this moment of transition that we're in. So let me begin with you, Juan.
Sure. Eduardo, thank you for the invitation and for convening a forum to discuss a very important topic. I want to focus on a national security discussion and objective analysis of really what are the policy options before us. I want to level set a little bit by just kind of talking a little bit about what we did, and then pivoting to really what the opportunities are. And I'll try to stick to the 3 minutes. I'll start, I think, just by in terms of the context of the negotiations. I want to just make clear here that when we approached this under the Biden administration, neither I nor the president really ever expected Maduro to negotiate in good faith. And I would refer folks to testimony by Brian Nichols, where I think he characterized the U.S. position accurately and diplomatically by voicing our skepticism that the regime would actually allow an election where they did not control the outcome. Now let me say it in very diplomatic terms. We knew from the get-go that they would lie, cheat, and still the sanctions relief that we provided has not strengthened the regime. In fact, I think we were in a situation where we started out where Maduro was really the victim, and the international coalition that was initially started by the first Trump administration had fallen apart, and the pressure really was for the U.S. to change our approach. I think at the end of the really kind of where we are now, and we can get into the details of the rationale behind some of our decisions. The sanctions relief that we provided has not only allowed U.S. companies to, frankly, to be paid for a slight improvement, and actually made for a slight improvement in the Venezuelans' kind of humanitarian situation. I think anyone who believes that the sanctions were working or making Maduro weaker simply just doesn't understand gray markets, or really the mentality of, frankly, a soulless dictator who was, visiting Salt Bay while the population starved. Today, Maduro and his cronies are still visiting Salt Bay and still, rolling in doing well, except at least, if you look at what Roberto Patino and others have said, the situation of the Venezuelan population is a little bit better. So, I think when you think about the Venezuelan situation, I think there is a huge opportunity for the Trump administration. If you look at this problem set as one that is really a sense of kind of competing national security interests for the United States that are, one, the democratic picture in the country, but also the situation of external actors. I would name specifically China, Iran, and Russia, and also the migration situation, you have to look at really what the policy mix is and not disaggregate or compartmentalize these different policies. All of them impact each other. And so balancing them out requires a policy mix that is never going to be perfect. And I think there's an opportunity here in for the Trump administration. There's the well-known kind of Nixon China hypothesis that a conservative administration is the one that has the most is the most likely to be able to successfully reform a policy. And I think the Venezuela issue set really lends itself to this. But the idea that we're going to return to a maximum pressure strategy, I think doesn't suggest just a lack of understanding of the problem and where we are. And even, if you look at different interviews, Mauricio Claver Caron gave an interview at America's Quarterly not too long ago, where he laid out that, he said negotiations are the way. He said the Trump administration failed, the Biden administration failed, but we have to actually pursue one course, which is negotiation. I think that's a space for, perhaps a Secretary Rubio really can drive this space, make some progress, and be able to kind of maintain and even strengthen the international coalition that today has really, I think, marginalized Maduro. I think governments from the left, center, and the right are really seeing Maduro for what he is, which is a soulless dictator.
Okay, great. Well, thank you so much, Juan. Let me ask the same question of John Magdaleno, and John, I think we'll speak in Spanish. John, placer tenerte como siempre. Gracias.
Ustedes. Bueno, yo coincido bastante con Juan González en el sentido, en primer lugar, gracias por la invitación, Eduardo, amable, y placer estar con ustedes hoy. Yo comparto la impresión que tiene Juan González en el sentido de que la estrategia de máxima presión de la primera administración de Trump no parece haber arrojado un resultado favorable en los términos de haber producido una aproximación a la transición a la democracia, que obviamente es el objetivo fundamental de muchos sectores en Venezuela, pero tampoco parece haber resultado del todo exitosa. Parece haber fallado también en procurar una aproximación significativa, al menos al preludio de un inicio de la transición en el caso de la administración de Biden, de forma tal que tenemos enfrente dos experiencias recientes de administraciones norteamericanas que seguramente con la mejor intención intentaron utilizar instrumentos de política exterior que pensaron en su momento podía contribuir a esa aproximación, pero que en concreto, en la práctica, no lo lograron, de forma tal que la interrogante acerca de las opciones estratégicas disponibles para la segunda administración de Trump, del presidente Trump, es una pregunta relevante. Y sobre esto me gustaría especular, no porque tenga alguna preferencia normativa ni esté formulando alguna recomendación estratégica, me gustaría especular cuáles son algunas de esas opciones. Una opción es regresar al instrumento de las sanciones económicas con una presión equivalente a la del pasado, cuyos resultados ya podríamos conocer de antemano. En particular, en la literatura especializada se viene tratando en los últimos 20-25 años el creciente uso de sanciones financieras, se les llama smart sanctions. En verdad, digamos, un análisis comparado del impacto de las sanciones financieras y hasta sectoriales, que también han sido probadas en varios casos, no solo en el venezolano, conforme demuestra la Global Sanctions Database, un análisis comparado de los episodios de transiciones desde el año 1950 hasta el año pasado demuestra que la probabilidad de estimular una transición a la democracia por la vía del uso de ese instrumento es bastante baja. Primero, es menor el número de casos en donde se ha propuesto explícitamente mediante el uso de este instrumento una democratización. El caso venezolano, ustedes lo saben bien, sería una redemocratización. Venezuela tuvo una experiencia democrática prolongada durante no menos de 43 años hasta que se culminó la transición al autoritarismo encabezada por Hugo Chávez. Ya en 2002 o 2003 puede hablarse en Venezuela la instalación de un régimen autoritario, en particular uno bastante próximo a lo que Steven Levitsky y Lucan Way han denominado autoritarismo competitivo. Pero ese autoritarismo experimentó y ha experimentado a lo largo de estos años varias mutaciones. Es decir, después de esa primera transición y la instalación de un autoritarismo competitivo, después de las elecciones parlamentarias de 2015 se produjo, en mi opinión, la cristalización de la segunda mutación que llevó el régimen autoritario venezolano a uno de carácter hegemónico. Hay una diferencia sustantiva entre ambos tipos de regímenes políticos, es decir, entre ambos tipos de regímenes autoritarios. Y a partir de la elección del 28 de julio próximo pasado, me parece que estamos en presencia de una tercera mutación que amenaza, subrayo la expresión, porque no es que se haya concretado, pero que amenaza ciertamente con un desplazamiento hacia un régimen que la literatura especializada llama autocracia cerrada, con un par de agravantes. Hay cada vez más visibilidad de rasgos, cuando menos pre-totalitarios, en concreto esta obsesión por el control de los medios de comunicación, es decir, es cada vez mayor la presión sobre ellos, en particular la introducción de nuevas leyes aprobadas ya por el Parlamento Nacional que restringen mucho más severamente el espacio de actuación de partidos políticos opositores y de la sociedad civil, organizaciones de la sociedad civil. Señaló como ejemplo de esto la ley contra las ONGs, ya fue aprobada, la ley contra el odio, que ya fue aprobada, y la ley contra el fascismo y el neofascismo. Las tres, en verdad, son leyes que restringen aún más el ámbito de actuación y podría decir que incluso libertades civiles esenciales como la de pensamiento, opinión y expresión, la libertad de asociación, la libertad de movilidad, el habeas corpus, la inviolabilidad del hogar privado y la inviolabilidad de las comunicaciones privadas. Lo que está pasando en Venezuela después del 28 de julio es sumamente grave. De forma tal que este es el contexto venezolano frente al cual hay que pensar en opciones de política exterior para el caso de la administración de Trump. Y veo, este sería el centro de mi intervención, para no extenderme mucho, las tres opciones que veo son en lo esencial, digamos, probar con un nuevo tipo de negociación en el que sí se hagan algunas concesiones en materia económico-financiera, pero a cambio de la restitución de algunas garantías que están siendo seriamente violadas. Es un primer formato y objetivo de una negociación en esta nueva etapa. En segundo término, vería el escenario de volver a utilizar las sanciones económicas como el principal puntal, vamos a decir así, el principal instrumento de la política exterior. Ya creo que conocemos de sobra los posibles resultados en esta materia y la última opción estratégica disponible, hablando de forma muy gruesa, sin especificar detalles y variantes. Por ejemplo, Juan González hablaba de como un pool mixto, de una combinación de instrumentos. Es posible que esto termine configurando mejor el diseño definitivo de la política exterior. La tercera opción de política exterior disponible, no porque la sugiera, no porque me guste, sino porque tratándose de Trump, un actor, considerando a Trump como un actor impredecible, habría que considerarla analíticamente. Trump podría explorar algún instrumento de mayor presión. No creo que sea bajo el formato de las viejas intervenciones militares extranjeras del siglo pasado, como en el caso de Panamá y Granada. Creo que ese formato, además de haber estado en desuso desde hace mucho tiempo, tiene muchos impactos, costos y riesgos como para ser considerado. Pero sí pienso que el presidente Trump podría considerar, digamos, algún instrumento de política exterior de mayor presión que incluso las sanciones, que podría involucrar alguna disuasión de tipo militar. Esas son, en lo esencial, las tres opciones que veo disponibles. Son más preguntas las que tengo que respuestas respecto del diseño definitivo de la política exterior, pero me parece que la administración de Trump podría pasearse por las tres, una de las tres, una combinación de instrumentos novedosos de política a estos efectos. Esto es todo lo que yo tendría que compartir hasta el momento.
Perfecto, muchas gracias, John. Hussein, la misma observación general así para comenzar la discusión, ¿no? Or in English, whatever, or I think we're probably going to struggle with Portuguese, but.
No, I mean, I can make it in Portuguese, in English, or in Spanish. So let's go in English.
Okay.
Well, thank you very much, Eduardo and you, Brian, for the invitation. It's a pleasure to be with Juan Gonzalez, old friend, and with John in the same panel. So I would like to start to talk about the current Brazilian strategy on Maduro and Venezuela. And I think the Brazilian policymakers, they don't have a monolithic view on Venezuela, even though the strategy toward Venezuela went in one direction and has proven its course that it's wrong, right? So it was a big struggle within the administration that Brazil should have addressed Venezuela in different way. And I will start with that. Brazil basically, since Lula third term, decided it was a struggle between two groups. The first group believed that Venezuela is a strategic partner. Maduro has been reintegrated to the Latin American and especially in South America. His legitimacy has to be restored, and he must be integrated in the political arena of the region as a legitimate president of Venezuela. And the other group, they were much more cautious about the anticipation of legitimacy toward Maduro's regime, because this group knew that Venezuela will face an election and Brazil must be prepared for the consequences. So it was two groups within the administration, one much more cautious about the future and the Brazil alternatives, and the other one was more leaning toward, no, we should offer Maduro, we should now start to show our goodwilling in order, and that will give us leverage, and the leverage will help us to convince Maduro to become, quote unquote, a little bit more flexible and more democratic. And that has been a big mistake, right? That has been proven a big mistake. So what has happened that they misjudged Maduro's intention. And especially when they created a Barbados group, they misjudged Maduro objective. Maduro never, ever had or planned to go for or after a fair and legal elections. Never, ever. He strategized all the time to cheat in the election, to distort by all means the results, and to eliminate step by step all the competitive adversaries, right? And that was under the nose of everybody, and especially of the Brazilian current administration. And somehow Brazil were kind of sending signs that that diplomatically not pressuring Maduro, but in the way that saying, well, you have to be cautious about that. That will put the current Brazilian administration bad spot. But they never ever took a real strong step and public strong step against it, and that was the big failure of the Brazilian foreign policy toward Venezuela, right? So, and Maduro achieved to convince Celso Amorim's group that he is capable to win the election. He is capable to win the election without requiring to go for a fraud, without needing to fraud the election, actually. And that has been transmitted to to President Lula. They are capable. The third aspect that the Brazilian government underestimated the opposition, the capability of the opposition to articulate itself and to win the crowd. and the opposition to articulate itself in several regions within Venezuela, right? So that was, in my opinion, the biggest failure of the Brazilian foreign policy, because they were only looking toward what Maduro were informing, toward what Maduro were saying and Maduro allies were saying, but they forget to engage the opposition. Actually, they refuse to engage the opposition to a certain extent, right? So, and that why here it is an ideological question, because, and here there's very, I would say, ideological question, because the calculus was that, and especially for the, as I said, there's two groups within the administration. For the first group, who always think ideologically, so, but they cannot assume that in, I would say, publicly, right? Basically, well, if Maria Corina Machado groups wins, that will favor Washington, that will favor U.S. establishment, that will favor United States at all, and the West, right? And on the other hand, that will weaken in their vision Lula's administration, that will weaken the anti-Western allies either in Latin America or or the anti-Western blocs, BRICS, whatever, right? So here the interpretation is not necessarily about democracy, rule of law, Maduro winning or not winning. So what will be the ultimate goal beyond the region, beyond South America, right? So that were basically the calculus of this first group. Whether the other group were thinking, no, it doesn't matter. We should really care about the Venezuelan people suffering. What Maduro is doing, it's really dangerous, and we don't want the installment of a characteristically a dictatorship in our border, right? Because it was undeniable that what we had at that time, it's in the current situation, it is a dictatorship, right? So so Brazil basically underestimated the role of the opposition. Well, and afterward, what has happened when Maduro frauded the election and he declared himself the winner, Brazil knew it that he frauded, and it was so bizarre when Brazil asked for las actas electorales to recognize the results. Maduro refused, and basically, and here the relation between the Lula's government and Maduro became very tense to the extent that now they are in the middle of a diplomatic crisis. Basically, Maduro accusing Brazil of intervention in the Venezuelan internal affairs and etc., and accusing even Amorim himself that he's like a Washington thugs, and I mean, and he's accusing indirectly Lula by undermining his legitimacy and etc. So the retribution that Maduro gave to Brazil, it's basically accusing Brazil by defending U.S. interests in South America or in Latin America at large. And Brazil basically, after what has happened, said that they're not going to recognize Maduro's new term, right? Okay. Well, what will happen with Trump right now in the White House, in the new administration? That would be a very interesting challenge. First, Trump's comes in a new, different scenario for Venezuela, because at that time, Maduro legitimacy in the region were acceptable to a certain extent among the Latin American head of states. So he was not declared as illegitimate president by all. This is one. Second, Trump doesn't need to invent or to create or to endorse the declared president such as Juan Guaido. He doesn't need that situation, right? It's not coming in that kind of context, right? When you have Edmundo Gonzalez, it is the legitimate elect president, right? And several countries in Latin America and outside Latin America, they recognize Maduro as the loser and Edmundo Gonzalez is the legitimate elect president. So this is a very important question. Several Latin American states, they will not recognize they're not recognizing Maduro's victory, and they will not recognize Maduro new term. So that will open the spot to legitimately the new U.S. administration to exercise pressure over Maduro. The question it is, what kind of pressure? Because all kind of pressure in the past, so far, they didn't work with Maduro. I mean, maximum pressure, more sanction. What kind of sanction? Isolation. Maduro doesn't care about isolation. Isolation in Latin America, well, he still have connection with China, Russia. I mean, several countries in Africa, Middle East, Asia, Iran itself. So he can still navigate, right? Because he has only one product, the country monoproductor. So only oil. It doesn't produce nothing. There's no industries, doesn't import, doesn't sell. There's only one product, right? So that it's important to see. So what kind of the strategy of maximum pressure. So, and I kind of a military intervention that doesn't seem an alternative, because that's what China eventually and Russia, they want to see the US immersed in a regional military conflict, right? Okay. In Latin America. To conclude, here will be interesting to see how Brazil, Lula's administration and Trump administration, how they can work. I'm not saying closer, but in the same direction with that, because Brazil, in my opinion, will remain quite distant from Caracas, at least for the next year or so. So okay. Between 25, 26 will remain quite distant from Maduro. One thing we have to remember, Venezuela has signed an accord with China to export oil till 2050. Or that means for the next 25 years on a stable price of the barrel of oil. So it doesn't matter if the barrel goes to 200 or drop to, to 50 or lesser. So they achieved to sign an agreement where Venezuela will sell it X barrel a year for a very static price to China. So that will guarantee Venezuela economic and somehow stability for the next 25 years. And that is beneficial to China, right? And that will guarantee no matter the fluctuation of the price, that will guarantee Venezuela stability. So Venezuela achieved to deal with so that to circumvent actually in somehow the economic sanction. So that said, I will stay here.
Okay, thank you, Hussein. It looks like we lost Juan Gonzalez somewhere. So I hope it wasn't in reaction to your comments, Hussein.
Not at all.
Joking. Okay, so we've sort of set then the scenario here, the context for what will be the next round. And let me ask you something that's a little bit more pointed. And as all of us know, this week there have been two very interesting decisions. One on the part of the U.S. Congress, where basically Congress passed, or at least one part of Congress approved the so-called Ley Bolivar, right, which sanctions anybody doing business with Venezuela, and the full reach of that, of course, we don't yet know. But also yesterday, there was a very important announcement on the part of Secretary of State Blinken, which is the formal recognition of Edmundo González Urrutia as the president of Venezuela. What does this mean, and how might this be considered in addition to the context that both of you have set? We'll wait for Juan to hopefully log back in. So John, how is this in your view? How does this condition the current moment? What kind of an impact are both of these announcements or decisions likely to have in the current transition context, at least leading up to January the 10th? John?
Yes. Bien, Eduardo, estos dos primeros anuncios, tal y como los interpreto, abren la posibilidad, una combinación de instrumentos de política exterior para el caso venezolano. Dicho de forma muy didáctica, creo que la ley Bolívar será leída por el gobierno venezolano como una amenaza, y de hecho ya hubo un pronunciamiento del Parlamento Nacional sobre la materia. Hay una resolución que se adoptó en rechazo de la aprobación de esta ley o de este proyecto de ley. Y por otro lado, se abre la posibilidad de una negociación, que es en donde veo que están centradas las mayores incertidumbres sobre el destino final de la administración norteamericana. Dicho de otra manera, creo que las dos medidas, por un lado, el proyecto de ley Bolívar, y por otro lado, el anuncio del secretario Blinken, en el que reconoce la victoria de González Urrutia, abre desde luego el compás, digamos, para saber cuál va a ser la decisión definitiva del gobierno. Por lo pronto, lo que parece estarse configurando es una política exterior que, por un lado, presiona o busca presionar a la administración de Maduro, y por otro lado, desde luego podría abrirse ulteriormente a una negociación, pero las concesiones que tendría que hacer Maduro para que alguna oferta del gobierno norteamericano, como por ejemplo renovar las licencias o incluso flexibilizarlas mucho más de lo que la administración Biden lo logró, las concesiones que tendría que hacer Maduro, repito, deberían ser demasiado gruesas, importantes, como para que la estrategia central de la presión, que creo que es la que gobernará la política exterior norteamericana con la administración de Trump, la segunda administración de Trump, no se concreten. De forma tal que lo que veremos es un compás durante un periodo para saber hasta qué punto Maduro está en disposición de negociar, qué cosas en concreto está en disposición de conceder, por ejemplo, qué restituciones de garantía estaría en capacidad de conceder y en disposición de hacer. Pero desde luego creo que ambas señales que se envían comunican la idea de que la administración norteamericana va a presionar mucho más severamente a la administración de Maduro. Esa es la hipótesis central con la que me muevo. La gran interrogante que queda por responder, lo sugería ya en mi primera intervención, y creo que varios de los panelistas también apuntaban en la misma dirección, es cuál es el instrumento o la combinación de instrumentos de política exterior específicos que se van a utilizar para intentar buscar una negociación con Maduro. En este momento en que estamos hablando, Maduro todavía parece estar operando en el modo de confrontación. Todavía hay detenciones arbitrarias de líderes. Todavía hay violaciones severas de garantías como libertades civiles. Es decir, probablemente Maduro esté pensando en que después de la toma de posesión del 10 de enero podría abrirse ese compás. Pero entre tanto, obviamente, no creo que la administración norteamericana abandone alguna estrategia que lo presione y simultáneamente le ofrezca algún incentivo. Creo que ese sería el encuadre, el framing estratégico de fondo.
Juan, estábamos asumiendo que nos habías abandonado porque habíamos dicho algunas cosas que no te
Fue el régimen, pero yo oí todo, Eduardo. Lo
Bueno,
tengo que decir porque cuando nos echan la culpa a nosotros hasta cuando se les desamarran los zapatos. Si yo puedo reaccionar, Eduardo, para no para usar el tipo, mira, look, the Bolivar Act amounts to a codification of the sanctions that are in place and amounts to an embargo. And I'll say that, look, that just hasn't worked. It hasn't worked in Cuba. It is not going to work here. And and let me take a step back as to why, and maybe talk a little bit about what the negotiating space is, because I think Hussein has, landed on some really good analysis, as well as Jonathan. Look, the sanctions that were put in place under the Trump administration hit their high water mark right around September of 2019. Today, the regime is fully sanctioned. They're just short of full blocking sanctions. I think the only thing we could do more right now is start sanctioning local Venezuelan banks to try to even squeeze more the availability of dollars inside the country, or do secondary sanctions, which would put us on a collision course with our friends and allies, not just in the region, but in Europe and in Asia. So today, Venezuela is selling all of its oil, 100% of its oil, albeit at a slight discount, on the black market on Iranian sanctioned ships, where they transship that oil and it goes to other destinations. So no additional sectoral sanctions will actually put a squeeze on this on the regime. And I think it was said, I think Jonathan said it really well, that sanctions alone are not going to lead to regime change. They may lead to a change in behavior, but in the absence of a mediation effort, then such broad sanctions are really just, I think, really just there to aggravate the humanitarian situation, because they're not really looking for an exit strategy. The idea that you're going to put the pressure, increase the suffering of the Venezuelan people and the regime at the same time as a theory of change is not only wrong, it won't work, right? So the question is, what mix of sanctions are really the ones that are going to be used? I think really the approach of U.S. policy should be to really try to focus on targeted sanctions. But when you're looking at really the blueprint and the negotiating space, there are a number of different sanctions that really should be put into different buckets. The first one are a set of sectoral sanctions, right, that are on the energy and on the financial sector. Obviously, we reimposed sanctions on the gold sector. There were a number of sanctions on human rights abusers and corrupt officials. And I'll say that under the Obama administration, it was then Vice President Biden that insisted that the executive order that we put out gave maximum flexibility to the U.S. government to actually impose sanctions on the basis of corruption, which, as you know, can be very hard to do. You need to put policy elements inside an executive order to be able to do it. And even though the Verdad Act passed, it didn't call for that. We kind of went further than what the Verdad Act called for. And then there are individual sanctions. So those are kind of the three buckets. Then the second kind of set of questions are that we really kind of explored were, okay, which sanctions will lead to increases in revenue for the regime, and which ones will not? Because one of the things that we, as a policy matter, made very clear that any sort of policy alleviation, we did not want to actually give the regime a lifeline in terms of revenue. So even the General License 44 that we issued is one that sent a signal, but international oil companies aren't going to sink millions or billions into Venezuela until on the promise of a future election. I think they were all waiting to see whether the regime would respect elections. So it didn't really lead to a huge windfall. It was meant to be a public signal to the regime. Also, some of the individual sanctions, which are private, I would add, general licenses, for those that don't live and breathe this, general licenses have to be published. They're public. Individual licenses are private. And there was a long list of requests for individual license from the private sector to be able to enter the oil sector, but also requests to be able to enforce judgments by going after assets. So there were both carrots and sticks on the individual side. And those that we approved, one that was for Trinidad and Tobago, we knew that the revenue would not come for 3 years. So we used that as an incentive. right? So I think when you're thinking about the incentives and disincentives is in the negotiating space, is figure out is trying to prevent the regime from actually alleviating the pressure right away, because one of the main motivations for them was revenue. I think also understanding that what they were ultimately looking for was a return to some status quo ante that existed during the Obama administration, where we did not get along, but we recognized the regime, and found a way to kind of work together. The question is, under the Trump administration, is it possible for them? The question of recognition we can kind of get into, but right now, the regime, for example, one of the biggest challenges the regime has is that it cannot argue their cases in U.S. courts. So, the recognition question, that is the main impact that is actually on the regime. They, for example, aren't able to try to defend the liquidation of Citgo. That's something that is actually being managed by the interim government. But as a result, what's happening right now is Citgo is going to be sold. The Trump administration in the spring of next year is going to have one more license that they're going to have to approve, right? They are going to have to decide whether or not to approve the sale. And there's a national security argument where they could decide to deny that license, but the courts may completely ignore the administration's decision and move forward with the sale anyway, right? So the question of recognition, particularly when there are 16 judgments, when there are judgments in 16 jurisdictions, not just the United States, the question of allowing the regime to actually be able to argue its case and actually be able to negotiate with debtors is really central as well to the negotiation where the administration really holds the key. So again, there are the sectoral sanctions, there are the kind of individual sanctions, there's the question of recognition, elements of really kind of revenue really should figure prominently in the kind of consideration of what really we're valuing as an administration and any sort of kind of onward negotiation. And I would add to that, what sanctions will actually drive a wedge between Venezuela and external actors. I'll give an example. When we stopped selling diluent to Venezuela, Iran stepped in as the main provider of diluent. When a European company came to us and asked for a comfort letter so that they could sell diluent to Venezuela, we said absolutely, because we saw in our interest to actually drive a wedge between the regime and because Iran's doesn't actually deliver on time, doesn't deliver quality. So better, the Venezuelans wanted a European provider, and it allowed us to actually help drive a wedge. So a lot of these are competing factors, and I haven't even gotten into the migration question. For the United States, as in matter of national security interests, stabilizing the Venezuelan economy is key to actually preventing the outflow of migration. And if you see, actually, we looked at the numbers, and I'll stop here because there's just a lot to cover, but I wanted to kind of lay out some of the parameters and some of the kind of key elements here to consider. Is when the news of the negotiations became public, and the kind of initial kind of signals that the U.S. would provide sanctions alleviation, outbound migration from Venezuela practically stopped. And this is from a generally year on year, every year, approximately 1 million Venezuelans have left that country. And so this idea, the signal of hope, when you had a family that was, starving, right? And they were considering, do we stay here in Venezuela or do we risk our lives to walk across the Darien? The prospect of negotiations, and this was backed up by all the polling that looked at this in the run-up to the elections, the negotiations were a signal of hope to the Venezuelan people, and that alone stopped the outbound migration. But that's short-lived. There has to be some sort of economic stabilizing factor, and the question becomes, how do you help stabilize the Venezuelan economy without lining Maduro's pockets? And I think in that regard, there are opportunities for that, something that could really be workshopped. But I think that as we're looking at the democratic space to advance, the focus has been a lot on the presidential elections, but really the regional and gubernatorial elections are just as important, particularly as we enter in 2025. And trying to actually make progress in that space recognizing that there are pockets of democracy where governors and mayors have been elected and exercising their offices in a democratic, semi-democratic space. That needs to be recognized, and it's something that I think there's a space to really expand the kind of democratic base inside of Venezuela. I'll stop there. I threw a lot out there.
Yeah, thank you, Juan. That was a lot, and I want to turn to Hussein, but I want to press you a little bit, Hussein, on the question really of this recognition by Secretary Blinken and the U.S. government, the outgoing U.S. government. I mean, this, at least from my listening to Venezuelan radio this morning, is a big deal. People have seen this as something, but what does it mean in terms of how Brazil might look now at Edmundo González Urrutia? Does it really change the way President Lula might look at the situation in Venezuela now? Especially leading to, of course, to January, right?
Right. Yeah. Right. First of all, the decision of Secretary Blinken does not surprise Brazil, right? That was expected by all means, because U.S. since the beginning did not recognize Maduro's victory, and even Brazil did not recognize Maduro's victory. So let's be clear on that. And Brazil said, we only will recognize is you prove us that you have won the election by presenting las actas. So that was clear that Brazil did not believe on Maduro clean and fair victory. So that does not surprise Brazil. Brazil was clear also by saying that won't recognize Maduro's third term. And that implicitly means that Brazil implicitly and within the diplomatic circles, everybody knows in Brazil that Edmundo Gonzalez is the winner of the election. There's no secret. But this is a frank conversation within the Brazilian diplomacy and the Brazilian political system. Everybody knows Edmundo Gonzalez won, is the victorious of the election. So that's why Brazil is not going to recognize Maduro's new term. So that it is a clear decision. What will be the implication of that? Well, I mean, the implication already started. Maduro eager to join BRICS, Brazil vetoed Venezuela's membership to BRICS, right? And that made Maduro basically open fire on Lula, on Brazil, and even on his own friends that they were supporting his remaining in power, basically, by blaming them that they convinced Lula to not accept Venezuela and BRICS. I mean, that it is a reflection about the insatisfaction of Brazil with the course of what has happened in Venezuela. And basically, who negotiated Edmundo Gonzalez exile in Spain was Brazil directly with Maduro's regime. So with Spain also, right? So each one has its own role, but so in my opinion, what Brazil wants to do, it is to recognize publicly that Edmundo Gonzalez is the winner. So, but what Brazil will do is not recognize Maduro as legitimate and victorious in the election. So denying him his term, denying that he won the election, right? And that is a big, big deal, right? That is a big deal. That indirectly means that he lost, basically, to his opponent. And he forced his opponent to flee, right? By threatening his opponent, by and by arresting several other members of the opposition. So, well, will Maduro will be capable to negotiate with Brazil? I don't see room, frankly speaking, for negotiation right now, right? So there's only one window, 25. 26, Brazil will be immersed in, totally immersed in a presidential election, presidential campaign that will start in March, April, till the end of the year. So the election is in September. So September, at the end of September 2026, and the runoff in the end of October. So the campaign process start in March, right? So 26, forget about it. Nobody gonna be involved with Maduro and discussing Venezuela's future and whatever. So this is only 25. The first 6 months, I hardly believe that Brazil will be open to discuss, to talk with Venezuela, because Maduro has nothing to offer. Has nothing to offer. What he will say, oh, I'm gonna make the idea that Celso Amorim offered. They can compose a coalition, a government of coalition. Coalition with whom? I mean, he gonna bring the opposition to chair power? This is a stupid idea. I mean, come on. What he gonna give them? What kind of departments? I mean, you know, I mean, this is a madness idea. I mean, so, and they won the election. If they accept sharing power in a coalition, so they're assuming that they lost, and then basically endorsing Maduro fraud as the winner, right? So I mean, so I don't see a room. Brazil will organize the BRICS conference in the next 6 months. So it will be, I mean, if not mistaken, the second trimester of the next year. That will be a challenge, because Maduro is trying to, via Russia and China, to convince Brazil to be invited. And here it is. I highly doubted that Brazil will invite him, and I highly doubted that Brazil will accept Venezuela in BRICS due to the current situation, right? So that said, and what Juan were saying, I mean, in the short term, and that has been proven by the opposition, there are still some islands or still some state governorship and mayorship very important in Venezuela. And I think the focus and the investment in terms of strengthening the leverage of the people to be focused on these areas, right? This is the best investment that could be done in the medium term in order to counterbalance the regime authoritarianism.
Okay, thank you.
Eduardo, can I jump in like for 3
Yes,
seconds?
please.
It just look, the president-elect question, exactly as Hussein said, but the only question that matters when it comes to recognition is who is going to be the government that the United States and the international community is going to be dealing with after January. Is there going to be a government in exile, or are we going to deal with the regime? And there's an in-between there, but I think this administration is deferring on that question, rightly so, to the incoming Trump team. And so the question really is up to them.
Okay.
Yeah.
And that said, Juan, I also want to go back, and I want to bring John in on this, because you've raised so many nuances to the way in which U.S. policy, I mean, really the policy choices that you faced when you were there, and the choices that the next administration is going to come into. And you said very clearly, the new Bolivar law is really an embargo, okay? But that implementing it, of course, is a very difficult thing because of the secondary effects that it might have, right? So having said that, then, for example, and let me bring in sort of the discussion among the Venezuelan community here, and the Venezuelans who expect very much of a hard line by this incoming administration. that they think that the Ley Bolivar is a response to these community demands for returning to a very hard policy, right? That what the Democrats did is essentially, handed over everything, gave up on what the Trump administration had done in terms of advances, and now the Ley Bolivar, introduced by the way, our Democratic representative right here in Broward, sort of shows a bipartisan consensus to go into a very harsh approach and reenacting all of these sanctions. In fact, going beyond that. So John, what has been how do you see this go from now that Juan has added all of these elements to this? Tell me a little bit about how you see is there the kind of reaction that I'm talking about? What is the Venezuelan government saying with respect to Ley Bolivar? And is this what they expect, more of this, or do they expect that nuanced reality that Juan kind of discussed?
Pregunta es para mí, ¿entendí?
Sí, para ti, Juan, sí, porque hay Juan y John, ¿no?
Sí,
Entonces,
sí. Bueno, la reacción del gobierno venezolano por intermedio del Parlamento, que es casi decir lo mismo, ya es pública. Y la comenté en mi segunda intervención. El Parlamento sacó una resolución de rechazo a la ley Bolívar. Y digámoslo de esta manera, no veo en un contexto como el venezolano de hoy, en el que la amenaza es más bien caminar en la dirección de una autocracia cerrada, no veo a Maduro como dando grandes concesiones en materia de restitución de garantías, a menos que se produzca una presión vía disuasión, quizá militar. Repito, no estoy sugiriendo este curso de acción, pero lo veo francamente inevitable. Dado los más recientes nombramientos que ya se conocen de la próxima administración del presidente Trump, por ejemplo, Marco Rubio a la cabeza de la Secretaría de Estado, pero también otros nombramientos, la Secretaría de Seguridad, por ejemplo, la Secretaría de Fronteras o de Homeland. Es decir, dados estos nombramientos, quienes estarían ocupando posiciones estatales de primer orden son de línea dura. Y francamente, no veo a Maduro concediendo la restitución de garantías en ausencia de presiones. Esa es la hipótesis central que sostengo, porque efectivamente, digamos, Maduro acaba de robarse una elección, como mis compañeros de panel han señalado insistentemente, y no parece tener disposición manifiesta de reconocer y restituir garantías que en efecto ha violado severamente. Es decir, que podría pensarse en una combinación de instrumentos de política exterior, pero Juan González lo ha explicado muy bien. Ya se han explorado varias combinaciones posibles. Quizá la administración Trump en su segundo periodo intente reforzar las sanciones personales que me parece podrían tener algún impacto adicional que no se ha probado, digamos, de forma exhaustiva en el pasado. Pero de vuelta, el regreso de las sanciones comerciales y financieras lo que va a hacer es agravar la situación de sectores de la población. Y repito mucho porque para mí fue un hallazgo muy relevante al encontrarme con la Global Sanctions Database, que la probabilidad de que este tipo de instrumentos pueda promover el inicio, cuando menos, de una transición a la democracia es una probabilidad muy baja, muy baja. Está científicamente demostrado. Primero, el número de casos en los que la política exterior norteamericana se propone explícitamente conducir o promover la democratización en el país, en un país, lo hace por intermedio de sanciones, y esto es aún más bajo, la probabilidad es aún más baja cuando tienen éxito. De forma tal que lo que yo puedo pensar especulativamente hablando es que la administración Trump, digamos, en virtud del carácter, del temperamento, del estilo de toma de decisiones, va a explorar nuevos mecanismos de presión sobre el gobierno venezolano. ¿Y la reacción cuál será? ¿La reacción del gobierno venezolano cuál será? Bueno, probablemente aislarse. Aquí hay que decir otra premisa estratégica de partida. El aislamiento internacional de Venezuela no le conviene a los venezolanos. también hay mucha investigación académica sobre esta materia. El aislamiento a la postre desconecta a Venezuela precisamente de los sistemas de castigos de incentivos que puede proveer la comunidad internacional. Esa es una premisa estratégica obvia. Y la segunda es que en ausencia de presión, lo he dicho antes, pero lo reitero, en ausencia de presión veo poco factible que Maduro, de buena gana y motu propio, pueda restituir garantías en la dirección de una democratización. El gran problema de intentar promover democratizaciones o redemocratizaciones es que la mayor parte de los casos en los que tal cosa tiene lugar es porque se produce una fractura en la coalición dominante. Eso lo sugiere no menos de 83 casos que he podido investigar de primera mano a lo largo de 10 años. Y ya sabemos por las investigaciones del Biden Institute cuál es el número de casos de episodios de transición a la democracia que se han iniciado. Son 383 conforme a la data más reciente del año pasado, y de estos 383 casos, 145 fueron episodios exitosos, de forma tal que aquí viene una complejidad mayor. La mayor cantidad de los casos de transición a la democracia que se inician no concluyen exitosamente en la instalación de una democracia. 226 casos son episodios fallidos. Y cuando examinamos cuáles son las variables presentes, las variables domésticas son verdaderamente las decisivas. Es cierto que en muchos casos hay presión externa, pero las variables verdaderamente decisivas para iniciar el proceso de transición a la democracia son variables domésticas, y estas variables domésticas son una oposición que configura una mayoría a su favor y que le plantea una crisis de legitimidad al régimen autoritario, un ciclo de movilización colectiva verdaderamente masivo, organizado, que fue lo que faltó, en mi opinión, de cara a la presidencia del 28 de julio, que también le plantea nuevos dilemas estratégicos al régimen autoritario. En un contexto de creciente represión como el de Venezuela, es casi imposible plantearse con seriedad el inicio de un ciclo de movilización colectiva porque va a ser reprimido. Si ya hay más de 2.000 detenidos arbitrariamente como consecuencia de las protestas espontáneas que tuvieron lugar después de la elección presidencial, precisamente los días lunes 29 y martes 30, ¿cuál es la reacción del gobierno con un eventual nuevo intento de promover la intervención de esta variable? Bueno, la reacción va a ser igualmente represiva, me parece. En tercer término, las negociaciones han sido vitales en la gran mayoría de las transiciones, pero ¿qué probabilidad cierta hay de que, en efecto, Maduro tenga disposición real de conceder garantías a cambio de concesiones de parte del gobierno norteamericano? Mucho me temo, y hay otras variables que podría listar, pero no me quiero extender, mucho me temo que las opciones son verdaderamente reducidas a la hora de confeccionar un diseño de política exterior que, en efecto, procure una aproximación cierta de Venezuela a una transición democrática. Por lo tanto, veo inevitable que la administración de Trump diseñe algunos mecanismos o explore algunos mecanismos adicionales de presión, y creo que la disuasión militar puede estar dentro de su repertorio de opciones a contemplar. De vuelta, no lo estoy recomendando, no es una opción que me gusta, pero no parece haber demasiadas opciones sobre la mesa, a diferencia de lo que se decía en la primera administración de Trump.
Okay. Perfecto, gracias, John. Eh, bueno, ya estamos casi llegando al final del webinar. Eh, Tenemos solo una pregunta en el chat, pero quiero, I'd like to, let me go back to English. I'd like to ask Juan and everybody uh, to kind of react to the following. Uh, I mean, given the situation now, where we have a new administration, uh, which has largely promised the mass deportation of immigrants from the United States, as they call them, illegal immigrants, many of whom, of course, are perceived to be Venezuelans. In fact, the striking thing is that in this campaign, the Trump campaign, at least, never mentioned Venezuela as a foreign policy issue, but as a domestic issue, right?
Yeah.
And so, in fact, it's even surprising that President elect Trump never mentioned July 28th. Has yet to do something quite different from what Secretary of State nominee Marco Rubio has done, right? He's been very vocal about July 28th. But given that then the mass deportation that the president promises is of Venezuelans, right? How does the mass deportation strategy play into this whole logic that you've been talking about, Juan, and how does this play back home in Venezuela? And for that matter, what are the repercussions in terms of what it might mean if you in fact have an embargo, if you create this massive reaction in Venezuela, then more than likely Brazil will be receiving some of the outflow of migrants as well. So how is this mass deportation promise likely to play into the whole sanctions, non-sanctions, targeted sanctions, et cetera, that you've been talking about, Juan?
It's an excellent question, because it's a question of how the Trump administration views the negotiating space. I'll say just on the Bolivar again, look, the Bolivar Act is really good politics. But what's that saying? You campaign in poetry, but you govern in prose. The impact of an embargo on Venezuela is going to be the continued outflow of mass migration from Venezuela. And it's not something that is compartmentalized just to Venezuela. It starts impacting our allies. One of the things that we saw, and Venezuela, frankly, for the United States, is a domestic policy issue, because there are not just 1 million Venezuelans leaving that country. There's a stock of 6 million Venezuelan refugees in South America and Central America and in Europe. Traditionally, those populations, as a Colombian American, I remember when in the late 90s, Colombians were going to Venezuela. Traditionally, South America absorbs those populations. Well, if you have a situation where you have millions upon millions of Venezuelans, Colombia is not going to absorb them all. They're going to cross the Darien, and then you start seeing that your allies and your partners in the region are being impacted, and they're the ones that pressure you to alleviate pressure. Now, the question for the Trump administration is going to be, where do these different kind of priorities, right? The democracy question, the migration question, the external actions question. And I would say, yeah, let's throw in there the energy question. What value do they assign to each of those? Is there a scenario where they cast aside the democracy question, which is the hardest of all the different priorities, and they say, all right, well, if you see the press, Maduro has basically said, we'll negotiate a migration agreement with you in exchange for sanctions relief. If the Trump administration says fine, then there's a different and more narrow space for them to negotiate, which leaves the opposition out in the cold, frankly. I don't think you can negotiate the migration question without democracy. I think the democracy question is attached to everything. But the issue is, you can't just deport Venezuelans to Venezuela. The regime has to accept them. And Mexico may accept some. You may have the Colombians accept some. So how much strong arming is the Trump administration going to do to have other countries accept what could be millions of Venezuelans that are leaving the country? It's a really tough issue set. I'll say though, like, I have some optimism. I suffer from canine optimism, so that may be a fault. Is that few people, I think, understand this problem set than Marco Rubio. Not only was he on the Senate Foreign Relations Committee, but as the ranking member in the Intel Committee, he appreciates the comprehensive nature of the challenge, particularly how much inroads Russia made during the Trump administration, how much inroads China has made. Iran, not so much, but these are big problems that have regional implications. And I think one of the things that I think we should expect to see, which I think is good, is that as the Secretary of State, he's not going to be the Secretary of State for Latin America or the Secretary of State for Venezuela. If Marco Rubio is prioritizing the Venezuela question, his conversations with Russia and with China, that is good, because it means that we are making Venezuela into a global priority and not just kind of a domestic policy challenge that is really concentrated around the question of migration. But I think there's no easy solution to the Venezuela question. But again, I would underscore, you could try to do just migration, but you can't leave out the democracy picture. I think you start losing the region, you start losing the support of diaspora, and it becomes a much more complicated question where you go to the status quo ante, where you're basically aligning or engaging with the regime as long as they're willing to accept their migrants to be repatriated.
Great, thank you. Hussein, and then, we're going to have to wind it down now, so I don't think we're going to be kicked out, but we are now almost on deficit of time. So, and I've abused of your generous time as well. So, Hussein, a brief answer.
Yeah, well, I mean, no matter what, Brazil will suffer also as the consequence from the consequence of Maduro's authoritarianism and dictatorship. Of course, we have over 1.5 million of Venezuelan in Brazil, right? That impact the educational system, the health system. I mean, in many ways, especially in the northern border of the country, they are, of course, most welcome here. But we cannot forget that as much as Maduro, as much as the economic crisis up in Venezuela moves on, that will have a reflection on Brazil, Colombia, even in the United States and others. The matter of fact, I understand Juan's takes on dealing with Venezuelan government or whatever. The matter of fact, Maduro lacks of credibility. You know what I mean? Who trusts Maduro? I mean, it's not possible to establish any dialogue or negotiation, even with his closest friends. I mean, or he have failed, right? Like, look to the Barbados Accord, look to Lula's government, look to, I mean, what he have done with Petro in Colombia and even with Mexico. I mean, it's impossible to trust Maduro by any way, right? And he's not a viable partner that could be trusted to advance in any direction. So the lack of credibility, it's something. I mean, obliterate whatever process that you could start with Venezuela, right? So I will stay here. I'm not optimistic about Venezuela's future. I'm not optimistic about in the short, medium term. I'm not optimistic. I would say that in the long term, yes. I think perhaps working with small groups in region municipalities. So that, in my opinion, will change the thing in the long term. I would say in 1 decade or so, right? Also, that will make the regime losing its total and complete legitimacy and interlocution in the whole region, right? So that is a combination of variables that will even pressure the regime, and even internally the regime start to suffer by disease, to dismantle itself, right? To crack, right? So, but so far, Maduro still have the control of everything, the security apparatus, the military apparatus, the intel apparatus, and he's still being endorsed by external powers. So, I mean, he doesn't have any incentives to not pursue his dictatorship model so far.
Great, thank you very much. And John, te doy la última palabra. Entonces, sé que es un tema muy amplio, el tema de cómo la migración, el tema migratorio y en qué sentido pues puede haber un trade-off, ¿no? Entre migración y sanciones, como de alguna manera lo mencionó Juan González, ¿no? ¿Cómo lo ven ustedes desde allá?
Y yo rescato de la intervención de Juan González un statement que me parece de mucha importancia, porque él señala que obviamente la gran interrogación es cuál es la jerarquización que le va a dar la administración de Trump a los temas. Es decir, qué importancia estratégica le da a la democratización venezolana. Realmente este es una prioridad de su política exterior para América Latina. exhibir el trofeo de haber contribuido con la redemocratización de Venezuela, o le importa mucho más resolver el problema migratorio, visto que este fue un tema central de la campaña electoral, precisamente por la cual logra el triunfo, o le va a interesar, obviamente, como prioridad, a dejar un espacio de negociación abierto junto con presión para evitar el uso de sanciones, o por el contrario las va a utilizar para presionar a Maduro. Es decir, la jerarquización de los temas va a ser decisiva para saber cuál va a ser la orientación final. Pero sospecho, sospecho que Maduro podría tener interés en la cuestión migratoria. Es decir, sospecho que Maduro podría concederle eso, vamos, a la administración norteamericana, obviamente a cambio de algo. Entonces aquí vienen de vuelta los desafíos y los dilemas que plantea Juan González. Bueno, ¿qué hace con el reconocimiento de Maduro de cara al 10 de enero, que es la fecha de toma de posesión? Por cierto, formulo una pregunta que parecerá retórica, pero no lo es. El secretario de Estado Blinken reconoce a Edmundo González Urrutia como presidente, pero Marco Rubio hará lo propio una vez que se juramente el presidente Trump el 20 de enero. Yo pensaría hipotéticamente que sí, pero esto no se ha consumado. Lo tendríamos que ver como para saber mm, eh, cuáles son los issues que se van a agregar a esa agenda de comunicaciones que seguramente se dará entre la administración norteamericana y la administración de Maduro. Pero tiendo a pensar que para Maduro sería un issue en el que podría hacer concesiones. La habilidad que veo que deberá desarrollar la administración de Trump, la segunda administración, es que otras concesiones puede ofrecer al gobierno venezolano al mismo tiempo que lo presiona para conseguir algo el gobierno norteamericano, especialmente de cara a su audiencia natural. Es decir, yo me imagino al presidente Trump metido en un problema de opinión pública si en efecto se llega a un arreglo con el gobierno venezolano para asimilar una buena parte de las deportaciones de venezolanos. Pero, ajá, la opinión pública norteamericana se preguntará, ¿y qué logra? Además de eso, la administración norteamericana respecto del caso venezolano. ¿Importa o no importa la democracia como prioridad hemisférica y global? Entonces, ahí hay unos temas de, digamos, de política exterior que son muy gruesos y que obviamente solo la administración de Trump nos dará pistas y señales sobre ello. Pero tiendo a pensar que sí, que la administración de Maduro podría ver en ese tema una posibilidad para entablar algún tipo de negociación.
Exacto. Bueno, thank you so much to the three of you, and um, I think you actually answered the only question that was in the chat, which was exactly the question of, what will the Trump administration do after January 10th when Maduro loses all legitimacy, right? And I mean, is that that's really a great question that we will try to answer in more depth in our third seminar on December the 11th. As part of this series, we started last month, of course, looking at the pre-election scenario. Now that we have a new administration on the brink of assuming office on January 20th, but we also will be looking in December now at the situation in Venezuela after January the 10th. So again, Hussein, thank you so much for joining us. Thank you to Sebri for joining us on this. John Magdaleno, mil gracias por siempre tener la predisposición de participar en nuestros seminarios. Y Juan, thank you so much for taking the time this afternoon. We're sorry you were sidelined there as in hockey for a while, but thank you for being able to spend the afternoon with us. This will be we've recorded it. This will be published on our webpage, and hopefully you'll be able to those of you who are watching it now. Of course, this will be on there for others to use as thinking about what awaits Venezuela, U.S. policy toward Venezuela in the next administration. So again, thank you very much, and we'll end here. Oh, one more thing, I want to recognize Anthony Pereira, the director of the Latin American Center, who's been calmly waiting in the wings there. But he is one of the co-sponsors of this event of the Latin American Center. He was going to be here today, but had a class. But he's forced his class to listen to you. So, Tony, thank you again for always co-sponsoring these events with us. Thank you. Okay, I'll see you all. Bye-bye.
Bye.